let's just kind of like try to wrap up what we didn't get to last week. Yeah, so I mean, he got into a lot of interesting stuff, which is great. It's like, honestly, you could take apart pretty much any one of these like little subjects that we have in here and do a whole class on them, which is what we got from last week with Paul, with contradictions in the Bible. And that is a major area too, which I don't know if you noticed, but like people, skeptics in particular, will pick at. They really like to pick at the Bible a lot, and it's ways that we don't even really research, because it's honestly, it's not a whole lot interesting. It's not that interesting to like go into, for some people anyway, to go into the history of the Bible, because it is kind of just tedious historical stuff, and not everyone's into history. So, but because they think, there are a lot of skeptics think that this can actually uproot, our religion or our faith. They actually, there are critical points at which they do attack, which is what Paul went over last week. But this is another, he actually touched upon slavery a little bit, but he didn't get to the whole thing of slavery. So we're just gonna, kind of go through. I'm just gonna pick up the mantle here. So, does the Bible support slavery? So this is kind of like an uncomfortable fact or it can be an uncomfortable fact for Christians, which is that no passage actually condemns slaveholding. Which to our modern moral sensibilities, that just doesn't sound right. The issue, though, for a lot of this is how we define slavery, because the word for slavery in Hebrew is ebed, which doesn't necessarily indicate chattel slavery, which we think of from the 17th to 19th centuries, where you were kidnapped, you had no rights at all, there was no possibility of you ever becoming free, it was a permanent thing, and you were treated like property, right? That's chattel slavery, which is what we tend to think of with slavery, and that is not what the majority of slavery was in biblical times. There is one caveat to that. There was one instance in which it seems like, there's not really a whole lot of information about it, but it seems like that might have been sanctioned by God in some way, and we'll get to that. But before we do that, we got to talk about exactly what was the concept of slavery back then, the majority of the time. So, and there, we've probably heard sometimes from some people that they would use the Bible to actually justify slavery, right? So, because God does have certain things that he says about slavery, certain conditions in which it's permissible at certain times. And so there have been people that have used those passages to actually justify chattel slavery, which God strictly condemns. You cannot kidnap another person and take them as your slave. That was punishable by death, actually, in the Old Testament. So, and relative severity of slave practices, while it's good, it's something that we have to consider, it doesn't really clarify the Bible's stance on holding slaves. Just the ability to own another person as property, right? So that's kind of something that Natasha, gets out in the open. But we are going to kind of talk about, those difference in severity anyway. And different type, then there are different types of slaves in the Old Testament, right? So let's just kind of go into that. So indentured servants, this was really the majority of slaves in the Old Testament. And it really, the primary function of it was to act as a safety net. So if you fell on extreme hard times, there wasn't like a welfare system, there wasn't a way for you to then rebound from that. Now, there were safeguards that were put up to prevent this from happening, right? So God instituted several safeguards to prevent you from having to resort to sell yourself into indentured servitude, right? And this would have included instructing the Israelites not to reap the edges of the field. So some of us might remember from the book of Ruth, right? So that's what Naomi and Ruth were doing. So Boaz was not reaping at the very, very fringes of his field, so that those that were impoverished could, take that grain and, feed themselves. Another one is that they were, God instructed to lend to poor countrymen without charging interest, right? So they wouldn't have that extra burden of money that they would have to owe as a way to keep them from having to do something extreme like sell themselves into indentured servitude. And then he also allowed the poor to sacrifice less expensive animals at different ceremonial times, right? So Passover, you wouldn't have to necessarily sacrifice a lamb, you could do a dove, something like that. And that would be a way to reduce that burden. But again, all this was done to prevent something like slavery, because it is, even back then, this is not the best option. This is not something that God wants for you. But, if you get into this kind of terrible, awful economic situation, it can serve as a safety net so that you don't end up starving to death. Okay. But there's some things that we want to know about indentured servants, which is that it was entirely voluntary, right? This is not something that you would be forced into doing or coerced into doing. Like I said, if you were kidnapped, you would, that would have been punishable by death by whoever the kidnapper was. So you couldn't be forced into slavery. Secondly, you would be set free after 6 years. So on that 7th year, you would be set free. And that was, and more than that, actually, let's just kind of fast forward to the bottom one. Freed servants would then be generously supplied with grain, wine, and livestock. And that's why I was trying to figure out why I had that cow. Yeah. So they would be generously supplied so that, when they were set free, it wasn't like they were just kind of off on their own and they had no way to provide for themselves. They had means to do so because they would be provided with it. They also rested on the Sabbath, so they were kind of given the same rest that every other Israelite had. And then permanent servitude was optional. So there were cases where slaves maybe had it really good, right? They kind of liked their situation. They were able to provide for their family. Everything was going well. And they would then say, I will be your permanent slave if they really, liked their situation. If they had a good master and they knew the family really well, like that was something that they could do. But again, that was voluntary. They didn't have to do that. Okay, so this one is a little bit of a different category. I'm not even sure if this really works as a category of slave or servant, but this is what it says. So if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as the male servants do. Now, this is one that requires a lot of context, so that statement sounds pretty bad when you take it out of context. So what's going on here is that we have, all marriages were arranged back then, so most of us probably know that. And the reason, so what's going on here is when he says a man sells his daughter, that's essentially asking for a bride price at an earlier age. Okay. So if you're asking for a bride price at an earlier age, it's most likely because you need the money earlier. You're kind of in a state of poverty and you need to subsist. So, and what would kind of go on here is that the daughter would then she would raise in socioeconomic status because she would be adopted into a more wealthy family, and then the rest of her family would then be able to provide. So this is not a case of a father, just selling his daughter as a sex slave or something. That's what the charge that gets brought up against this verse is. And there's some things to know with this. So the woman wasn't able to be set free, right? So when people look at this verse as though it's an indentured servant type slave, well, they would ask, well, why doesn't she get to go free? Well, of course, this is not indentured servitude. So if a female was an indentured servant, she would go free like the male servants. But because this is essentially an extended betrothal period or an extended period of anticipation of marriage, she's a future wife. She's not a slave in that sense. That's why she's not to go free. So.
Yeah, I know. That's kind of hot.
Wait, what? Oh, yep.
If I have questions, I'll let you know.
Yep. Sounds good. Just some other things going on with this verse. If she did not please her husband, then she shall be let free. Hold on. She shall let her father redeem her again, right? So if for some reason the master decides not to go through with the marriage, at the time that she is marriageable age, because this bride price could be as young as, 2 years old, 3 years old, 5 years old, really young, right? So I know it really offends our conscience, but today, but this is just kind of how it was back then with arranged marriages, and it was really intended to prevent something like starvation. So because this daughter would have most likely starved to death if the family had no means to provide for her, and I don't think it offended the conscience nearly as much back then because all marriages were arranged. Essentially, the women didn't have.
And everybody got married when they were 12 or 14 anyway.
Yeah, so that's still really young. Yeah, it's really crazy.
Can you imagine?
I already married an old guy.
Oh boy.
I know.
Constantly reminded.
So once married to the master, she was to be treated as family. All right, so she was not to be treated as a slave anymore. This was really just an interim period where before she was, a wife, that she would kind of function as more of a servant. And that's just kind of how it was back then. But really, just kind of the theme that I'm trying to get you to see between indentured servitude and servant girls as future wives is really the function of it was to protect the woman from starvation in both. And in the case of the future wife, it was really the whole family because the father was in a bad situation too. So it's just a means to provide economic relief. Now, the one that makes us the most uncomfortable is this one. For foreigners as slaves, because they would be considered as property and could be held forever. Leviticus 25:44 goes into that. And I'll just kind of put up the 3 points. So they were not to be mistreated, right? So Leviticus 19 gives us clarity on that. So you're still not to mistreat your slaves, but this verse does seem to say that you can own another human being as property in perpetuity, which is kind of the principle that we wanted to see, like, does God actually allow for slaves? And in this case, he does seem to do that. Now, we can try to speculate as to why God would allow for this. Unfortunately, this is just speculation. This is not, God never clarifies as to why this particular situation is okay. But we can imagine maybe a few reasons as to why he might allow for this. First of all, foreigners, especially we think of like the time of Joshua, they were utterly destroyed. The whole population was, because they were conquering the promised land. And it was essentially judgment on those nations that had refused to, acquiesce to God this whole time. And so we could see this as almost a mercy in some ways because he's not actually killing them. He's allowing them, he's adopting them into, his people group as slaves. And this could be almost like a more merciful form of judgment. And God has used slavery as judgment before. It was after this time, but he did allow for slavery in the case of the deportation to Babylon, for example. He actually used something like captivity as a way to rein his own people back in, because what were they doing before they got put into captivity, right? They were going against God in pretty terrible ways, human sacrifice, worshiping idols, and that sort of thing. So we can kind of see this as a way for God to discipline people as well. Because you can imagine if they were being enslaved to Israel, well, what are they getting exposed to now? These are God's people, so they're going to be exposed to the one true God, and maybe potentially become actual believers in the one true God. So there could be a silver lining in that. What I kind of like to note about this, though, is that this is not something that was permitted for God's people, right? So this situation could not happen with God's people. You could not sell a slave, an Israelite, to another Israelite as one that they could have forever and ever and ever, and treat them as property. And what that tells me is like, well, what are the implications of this for the new covenant, right? Because God's children is not just an ethnic group anymore. God's children, everyone is a child. Everyone that's a believer is a child of God at this point. And with certain things that Jesus tells us to do, to love our enemies and to be self-sacrificial and those kinds of things, it does seem to a certain degree that this may have been fulfilled to some degree, and this is not something that really applies under the new covenant. So those are just kind of some of my thoughts. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Just to go back a little bit.
Yep.
You keep using the word slaves.
Right.
And we're referenced at least to the Israelites and stuff. But
right.
Wouldn't it be better to say servant, like we did in the one slide?
Yeah. So indentured servants. That is now it's just the word ebed is just it really is translated as slaves most of the time. We can in order to distinguish for our conscience, right? So that they would have understood what a slave meant back then.
Right.
But yes, we could just say indentured servant.
I'm just thinking like in speaking in today's
yes.
language, to say the word servant almost brings up like the British. The British had servants who lived at their house, who took care of everything, who were
paid
slaves.
for what they did. Yeah.
But they still had to be there. They
right.
still had to. That was their job.
Yeah.
For these people, it's like not that was their job, but it was their job because it helped take care of their family.
Right.
In a roundabout way. So I don't know.
I guess I don't know too much about England at this time, but could they, if they wanted to, leave? Because an Israelite couldn't. for those 6 years. They were there.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But for those 6 years, they were. It wasn't just like you were an employee. Like you would, they were your master.
You're there.
Yeah. So, but you had it was not the same kind of slavery that we think of as today. You did have certain rights, and I don't know if I mentioned this. If you could not be severely punished. If you had some kind of permanent injury, you were to be let go. So yeah, that you were not supposed to be mistreated at that time. So and the only one that seemed actually even the foreigners as slaves were not to be mistreated. So it was really I think the big difference is that they could hold them forever as foreigners as slaves forever, and just God doesn't really share his reasoning for that. It's just not in the Bible. But so we're kind of like forced into this place of like speculating as to how this could be merciful in some way, or why God might allow for that, and how it is less severe than the kinds of slavery that goes on in certainly other nations, where they were literally treated as property in every sense of the word. So cool. All right, so we got through that, and this is not to get even worse, but does the Bible support rape? So we're going to be covering some difficult stuff today. Yeah.
Paul knew we're trying to pay.
Yeah, right. So,
I'm gonna go with no.
yeah.
But the question is, why are people?
Asking that.
Why do people? I would like to know that question actually. Why do people think that?
We're going to get into it. So skeptics interpret a few passages to indicate that the Bible condones rape, and we're going to talk about those few passages. So biblical laws pertaining to rape. Let me just check my time. Okay, good. I still have time. So if a betrothed woman lies with a man in the city, and I think this is Deuteronomy 22:23 if you wanted to look it up. If a betrothed woman lies with a man in the city and the woman does not cry out, they are both to be stoned. Okay? So before we get into this, we have to define certain words here. What is a betrothed woman? Okay, specifically, what's a betrothed woman in the time of Israel, ancient Israel?
She was essentially married.
Essentially married, right? Good. So, yeah, if you had, had relations with another man at this time, that was considered adultery, right? So you just as much as if you had actually consummated the marriage. So she's a betrothed woman, an engaged woman, but really engaged really meant married back then, with a man in the city. Okay, so this is a city. What were like cities like back then? Anyone kind of know? Were they close quarters? Were they spread out? What was it? Any idea?
Close.
Very close, right? You were literally like on top of your neighbor sometimes. So the idea here is that if you screamed, someone would hear you. In fact, lots of people would probably hear you because of how close everything was. And so the what's going on here is that the Bible's trying to write out this way, like if it was non-consensual, you would scream out, right? And so and therefore the woman would not be stoned in that situation if she screamed out, if she screamed. But if she didn't cry out, then they would both be stoned because the assumption here is that it was consensual, right? That they were both in on it. So that's kind of what's going on in that passage. Any question about that? Does that make sense? Okay. So, something that some people will say, well, like, what if she had laryngitis? What if she, like there's, so,
Shut up.
right. Right. So, and I'm sure like things like that would have been taken into consideration. Like at this time, it's not like, I'm sure whoever it was in like the Sanhedrin or whatever would have, do you actually have laryngitis? Yeah, they nitpick.
Of course they are.
It's,
That's the point.
yeah, right. So,
Figure out every tiny little situation that could possibly.
What happens now to me?
yeah.
Oh, she was deaf and dumb. Why didn't she yell? Like,
Right. All right, so we covered that one. So this is going to be a slightly different one. So if a betrothed woman, so again, this is now still an engaged woman, which by all intents and purposes means married woman, is seized by a man. So the language here really seems to suggest a man forces herself upon her, who lies with her in the open country. Okay, that's the key difference here. What does that mean?
Well, it means nobody's gonna hear you scream.
No one's going to hear you scream, right? Then only the man shall be stoned. So clearly the woman is being protected in this situation because they cannot prove that it was consensual for her, right? So it might have been, but they can't prove it. And so she's being given the benefit of the doubt, and they're not going to kill her for it. So,
which again is much less severe.
right.
I remember here, speaking of that, I remember here too that like when God says, an eye for an eye.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is like way less severe than what everyone else was doing back then.
Right.
If you would have poked somebody's eye out, like they would have gone after your whole family,
Yeah.
and just wiped them out.
Right.
And God's like, no, we're just doing even for even. Like,
Right. That we can actually verify too.
Right.
If they couldn't prove it, then they would give you the benefit of the doubt. Yeah. So you're right. This was actually much less severe than what a lot of the other surrounding nations were doing, the pagan nations. Yeah, that's a good point, Ryan. Yeah. So these are this one's handedly the worst one, but there's a reason for it. So if a man seizes an unbetrothed woman, so that's the big difference here. So now this is a woman that's not promised in marriage yet, right? So she's unbetrothed and lies with her. Then the man shall give her father a bride price and be her husband. And so what this really looks like, and what it actually kind of is a man raping a woman and then marrying her, and actually being forced to marry her, which again offends every ounce of our being in modern society, because for one, arranged marriages aren't a thing. But really the key detail to know here is that if a woman had any kind of relations before she was engaged, there was no chance of her, no prospects of her ever getting married ever again. So, so this is really this was intended to be a way for her to subsist. So they were forcing the man to now provide for her for the rest of her life. That's really what's going on here, is that the man's not being rewarded for, being a rapist. He's being forced to now provide for that woman and support her financially, and to prevent her from, isolation as well. And there is a slight caveat to this too. It doesn't say this in the Bible, but you can probably interpret it that there would be a situation in which in which the man would not necessarily marry her. And that's in this slide here. So if a man lies with an unbetrothed woman, so again, a woman that's not promised in marriage yet, he must pay the bride price and she shall be his wife. And so what's going on here is we have, essentially two unmarried people, having, illicit sex out of marriage. Okay. So that's what's going on here. And so really the man is now just being forced to pay the bride price because he was essentially caught. So, but the father actually had the right to refuse to give the daughter. He would actually still have to pay the bride price in that situation, but he could refuse to give the daughter in marriage to the man. And so I think the way that some people interpret these passages is like, well, why would, this man, why could this man be refused, but not the rapist, right? So that just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So I think certain interpreters would probably say that, that this could also apply to the other one as well.
But I still don't. So in all of these circumstances, it seems to me like, yes, we're talking about rape. Yes, rape happened.
Mm-hmm.
And there's consequences for it. I'm still confused at why people think biblical laws support it.
Oh, you know what? I think I might have forgotten. So with this one back here, they will say that so she's not crying out loud enough. That's how they're interpreting that. So it's not because it's not because the assumption here is that it's consensual. It's because she failed to cry out loud enough, and so the woman's essentially being punished.
So the idea is that the woman is at fault because she did X, Y, or Z. Therefore, God says it's okay.
Yes, more or less. So that's at least how they're interpreting it. They're just saying that the God is essentially punishing the woman for not being as vocal or something. Yeah, it's a strange way of.
Sure I understand.
But again, if you understand the way cities were back then.
Oh, that's what they don't understand when they're making these objections.
It's already in your head that it's not like a city today where you're separated by
windows
concrete
and
walls and like you're basically in the next room.
Yeah.
In a single family house, you're in the next room, in the next room, in the next room. Like.
Yeah.
You're gonna hear what goes on in that house, no matter what.
Right, and they're not thinking about that. And so I think once you know like these details, what a betrothed woman is for one thing, and the nature of these cities, and just the laws back then, and unfortunately, or I don't know if it's unfortunate, but you were stoned to death if you were caught, cheating. So and that again is something that our culture has, ideas about, and so we kind of have to bridge that gap.
Okay with that.
Yeah, right. Is very okay with it.
And I think it's different. Like, it's just hard to think about living in today's culture because these women didn't pick their husbands, though, right?
No.
I mean, what if your dad hated you and gave you to
Some softball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
and
right.
right.
Not saying rape's okay, but like,
Yep.
I don't know. You're stuck in that marriage.
Oh, it's. I don't think
You know what I mean?
arranged marriage is not a good thing. I
I
don't
know.
like that setup. I think it was just the culture back then. Unfortunately, when we fell from Adam, right? So.
I was hoping that he got another wife and you were off
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, so there's kind of
Like,
a.
what if you did meet your Prince Charming on the street and?
duty.
I mean, obviously,
I don't
I'm
know
not
if-
saying
I don't
this
know
is
if
good,
that
but
would
like,
You
even
probably
been a
weren't, we
thought
wouldn't have been
then.
allowed to leave the house anyway.
yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
It's just hard to like think about in that culture.
Yeah. No, it
It's
is.
so
Uh,
bad.
But would,
Vastly,
but would that have even been a thought? Because like you
You
grew
just
up your
knew,
whole life like
yeah.
You don't get
you
to.
know mom was arranged with dad and grandma was arranged with grandpa. Like
Yeah,
it's just
how it is.
I have a good
Yeah.
friend of mine that I worked with for a long time who had an arranged marriage.
Oh wow.
She grew up in India and had an arranged marriage. And she would argue that it was a great thing.
which is
Yeah,
crazy to think
yeah.
about.
Yeah.
And we went,
Like,
and we went,
what do you
and we
mean
would
Yeah.
have back and
great
forth
thing?
conversations about
but
it.
to
like,
them, that
but
yeah.
like,
That's
but
how
it,
it is, yeah.
But it was what it was,
Yeah.
and
think about it.
and
if
and her
your parents-
husband was under contract from like both of their families to be like, you have to be the kind of man that this family needs. Like
and that's
the
just it.
expectations were actually so much higher. And I don't mean this like in a bad way, but like when they got married, the expectations for him were higher than they would have been like for Ryan culturally. So much higher.
But if you have two parents of the daughter and two parents of the son that both have
Their best
the
interest.
best interest of the children, and again,
Yeah.
it is
Right,
weird.
right.
it
There's
is
a lot of
weird.
ifs
But if
on
they
it.
but
Yeah.
if they both have the best interest of those children in mind, and they know the family, and they know the family, and they know the family, like then all of a sudden it
Oh, okay.
kind of makes
Yeah, but you
good-
can't tell me
it makes
that
better sense. Say that. you know?
that my parents. I mean, just making here. My parents are so poor they can't feed any of my family, but Brent's family is super rich,
And
so
there's no
we'll
way-
get in with him. Like he's a snot ball, but he's got money.
Oh, I'm
So,
sure that
you know
happened.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I'm sure that happened.
Yeah.
And that is, but it also makes me wonder, like in that case, like why is Brent's snotball family gonna take?
Let's turn it to
Of
Brent's-
course.
Sweet
Don't tell your mom and dad.
Yeah. It's just easier to explain, like when
Sorry, Brent.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be this morning. I don't actually think. I actually don't think you're a snotball in real life.
It's just easier.
But it does make me wonder, like, under what circumstances would the wealthy family want, like, why? Like, what are the whys of taking that
the other side.
that girl in poverty?
And maybe
I mean, she
And
might have been very
culture-
attractive to
And
the man.
culturally, I have
yeah.
my own reasoning that he's probably 50 and she's 14, and I have a lot of thoughts about that.
But I think
But I think that stems
with
out
the
of what-
Israelites and that we're reminded again and again that foreigners in this under the old covenant, foreigners are the enemy. So if you're arranging a marriage, even if it's under your social economic status, I mean you're arranging a marriage within our people, within God's chosen people. I think probably that plays a part in it too. You know,
That's true.
we're
Yeah.
not supposed to be marrying. Like when we were talking about that, it reminds me almost the slave part. It reminds me also of like God saying, you're not to be marrying people. You're not to be marrying foreigners. But then we have Solomon who marries hundreds
There-
of people.
Well, I think so.
outside of
So-
and it doesn't end well.
This
This week at home, sorry, we read, I forget if it was Chronicles or Kings, whatever it was, the chapter we read at home. And there was a part about Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Well, first, the voice
See
about
how-
concubines was a very funny word. And so I explained it in a way that, like, it was like your wife, but you weren't married. And
we'll leave it at that.
Jake goes, why would anyone want that many wives? Like, he just was like appalled at this idea. And he's like, what would you do? Hey, wife, and like 1,000 people show up. He's like, this is terrible.
Yeah.
wow.
It was-
See, right.
It was super comical.
Yeah. No, that's yeah.
Anyone want that?
So yeah, something that I was thinking about jumping off of with what you were saying is that a lot of times these regulations that God puts into effect is not ideal, right? This is because we do things
Right.
that
It's a
cause us to do
response
things.
a problem that they were doing.
Polygamy. There were laws
Yeah,
about polygamy,
absolutely,
and it wasn't don't do polygamy. It was this if we're going to do it, this is how you this is the lawful way to do it.
Right.
Right. Divorce. I mean, there's this given the certificate thing. Like there was, these were not God's ideal,
Yeah.
but he was, and all the laws about slavery. Same thing. I really don't think God wants us to have slaves. But again, this was meant to prevent, extreme socioeconomic hardship.
You could take you could take any of the rules in the Old Testament when you go through Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so forth. And that's what almost the whole thing is, of saying, like, look, this is a fallen world. This is the best way for you to live in it.
Right. I think it can be summed up in that way. If man was not sinful, we don't need Deuteronomy. We don't need Leviticus. We don't need any of that because we're going to do what's
We wouldn't
right
really need any of this.
Any of
because
the-
God would walk with us.
Right.
Like he did early on.
and needed. Yeah. So that's really kind of the function of these laws. The other one too, so with the rape thing, this is another big one that they're going to point to. So if a man sees an unbetrothed woman and lies with her, then the man shall give her father a bride price and be your husband. So this looks like he's being rewarded for his rape. So it's this one and the first one that they misinterpret the most. So the lying out in the open country part, not so much because the woman's not stoned to death, right? And then with the last one here, they allow the marriage to go on. It's just he has to pay the bride price, which, I guess that's understandable in arranged marriage culture. So bottom line, or a couple bottom line, men who raped engaged women were killed, and men who raped unengaged women were forced to support them financially. And so that's really that's the Bible's stance on rape. It in no way condones it. It just kind of had these ways of,
But these are the rules for if you're
going to do the thing, you're either going to be killed or you're going to be forced to provide financially. Okay, so how much time do I got? It's 9:56. I got 4 minutes. So that's okay. So approval to rape female war captives. So this is what it says in Deuteronomy 20. If a city does not make peace with you, you are to kill all the men and take the women, children, and livestock as plunder. So again, if we're not interpreting this in context, it looks bad because your mind can go anywhere. What does plunder mean? What is women and children? What are we doing with those women and children? Can we just do what we please with them? Thankfully, we have clarity. So, in Deuteronomy 21:10, it says that the female captives were either to be married or set free. So there was this process. If you were going to marry, a foreigner, there was like a month-long process where you would shave their head, they would pare their nails, they would, change into, Israelite clothes, so they would kind of, disengage from their former life and be assimilated into Israelite culture, and they would spend this month mourning the loss of their previous family, and after that month-long period, if he still wanted to marry her, then he would marry her, and then they could go on. But no, you were not allowed to marry, let alone rape them before that month-long period was over. And really, again, this is just another instance of where women and children, if they could not marry the Israelites, they would have had no means of providing for themselves, and they would have been in destitution, all of them. So this is, again, another instance where it's protecting women and children in this case. And then, they did get to take the livestock and plunder, but that was just a common practice of that day. So this is a weird one. Approval to rape the women of Jabesh Gilead. Who knows this? Anyone know this one from Book of Judges? It's a really fun story. No, not really. Yeah. So this is kind of one of those stories. Does anyone know how the Book of Judges ends? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna say, it just didn't end well.
it did not end well with the Book of Judges. And so this is, if I can just get through this in 2 minutes, I'm going to try. So basically what's going on here is we have a Levite who's traveling along with his concubine, and he goes to this place called Gibeah, which is in the tribe of Benjamin, or it's one of their territories. And this man takes him in. Okay, but there were criminals that came and started pounding on the door, and they wanted to rape the man. Actually, they didn't want to rape the concubine; they wanted to rape the man. And so the man who was housing him said, "No, don't do this evil thing." And he actually offers him his own daughter, which is weird enough. But then the Levite says, "No, take my concubine," and he gives the concubine to them, and she ends up dying. So they have their way with her over the course of the night. She's not dead in the morning. He tells her to get up, and then she dies. So it's an
Where's
awful
that?
story. This is in I think 19. Judges 19. Yeah. Where you can read that story.
That's a good family one.
There you go. Yeah, have fun with that.
We moved on to Advent. Thank you.
Well, good. Look forward to January. So you have. I lost my train of thought. Okay, no, it's good. So they kill the woman. Okay, so then the Levite
That's why he was.
does this really interesting thing where he's all upset. He's like, "Well, look what she's done to my wife." I'm like, "You gave her to them. Why would you expect?" But he gets all upset and like flustered about it. He chops her up into 12 pieces and sends a piece of her to every tribe in Israel. Okay, so graphic, but I guess he gets a point across because then the tribes of Israel all get really upset and they go to Benjamin. They're like, "Hey, why did you allow this evil thing to occur?" And they refuse to give up the criminals who did it. And so then they all basically declare war on Benjamin, and they decimate them down to a population of 600 men. And so then they all get upset. It was like, "No, we can't. We don't want Benjamin to completely go away." And because I forgot to mention, they also took a vow not to allow their women to marry into Benjamin. So they really had no means of reproducing. So then they end up attacking this other town called Jabesh Gilead and essentially kill all the men and married women there and take all 400 virgins and offer them to Benjamin, and then Benjamin goes on and survives. And so obviously this is a really messed up situation that we're looking at. And skeptics will look at this and go like, well, God just allows for the 400 virgins to get stolen and abducted and, given, off to Benjamin. And God had nothing to do with that. Okay. God did not approve of any of this. Okay. The only part where it says the Lord spoke was when when judgment was being cast upon Benjamin, right? So he commanded Judah to go first, and then each tribe to then attack afterwards. But he had no decision in going and attacking Jabesh Gilead or any of that. And so that's something that you got to take into mind. Sometimes is this prescriptive, descriptive thing, right? This is describing a terrible thing that happened in the Bible that God did not prescribe, right? God did not say, go do this. It's kind of like reading a newspaper sometimes. Like the newspaper describes murders, doesn't mean that we're all supposed to go out and murder people. And that's essentially...
It
I think
gives
that's
you
a really
an
good
idea too of like what the culture of that day, like stuff like this happened.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why like they thought this was the right thing to do. They thought this was the way to handle this and chop her up and send her. I mean, that's what that time period, that's what they said. Yeah, that's what we do,
Right.
I mean, like,
It was just a much more primitive culture than what
Yeah.
we have today. Yeah, and it really does offend our conscience in so many levels. But when we look at it with context, it helps us to kind of understand where they were coming from and what God was thinking in his laws that he made. I probably don't have time to get. Yeah, we're about done. Maybe we can talk about human sacrifice next week. In short, the Bible does not support it.
The Bible says no to that too.
Yes. Very emphatic no, actually.